Okay, so we have a critical mass of over 70 people. So let me start. First of all, I hope everybody had a very enjoyable summer. For me, for me, it was too short, but I hope yours was very, very good. And I'm glad to be able to start our webinar series again this semester. And I'm delighted for the one that we have today. Just to give you a little bit of a background to it. I have a good friend, somebody that I've worked with on far right extremism for a long time, named Travis McAdam, who is an excellent researcher at the Montana Human Rights Network. And the Southern Poverty Law Center wisely scooped him up. And he emailed me back in January saying that he was putting together a webinar and thought that I'd find it interesting about the dangers posed by the new Apostolic Reformation. And he said there in the email he sent me, he said that, quote, there is something missing from news coverage of major trends and events from the rolling schisms in mainline Protestantism to elections in the US. It's not a small thing. In fact, it's one of the driving forces of some of the most urgent social and political matters of our time. And he said the missing piece is discussion of the role of a major religious movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. You may have heard of it, but it doesn't get the attention it deserves. And one reason is that it can be hard to understand and explain. And I hadn't heard of it, and I was fascinated by it. And the SPLC put together a webinar, and two of the five people who participated are the ones that I'm having join us today because I learned a lot from them, and I hope you will. I know you will too. Um, Julie Ingersoll will speak first. She is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, where she teaches and writes about religion and American culture, focusing especially on gender, violence, politics, and the religious right. She's written numerous books and articles on these topics, including Building God's Kingdom, put out by the Oxford University Press, and Evangelical Christian Women War Stories from the Gender Battles by New York University Press. She'll speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then she'll be followed by Peter Montgomery. Peter is the research director at People for the American Way and oversees its right wing project, which produces daily reporting and analysis on the religious right and its political allies. Peter has been following writing about these movements for more than 20 years and is a frequent resource for national political reporters. I'm delighted to have both of them with us today. What we'll do is, in our usual format, they'll both speak. In the meantime, feel free to put questions in the Q&A, which I will moderate when they are both done. But first, let me turn the floor over to Julie. Please educate us.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. This invitation was an opportunity to learn about the Bard Center, and I'm really fascinated by the work you do. It's important, and I'm glad to have been able to help out. I am going to quickly share my screen here. There we go. Okay. So you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky, and I do enjoy hearing from people who attend these various webinars, workshops, whatever. I like to hear. I end up hearing from lots of people who grew up in these movements, and that's always kind of rewarding to find the work helpful to them. So this is as Ken mentioned, I've been doing a series of these webinars over the last couple of years, but I got interested in the center and started to read some of the other things and look at some of the other webinars you've done. And so I reworked this a little bit in relationship to the focus that you guys have on hate, because you know, the movement that I study has a deep-rooted theological justification for hate. And I don't remember having been invited in another opportunity to talk about that particularly. So there's a little of that in the presentation, and we could talk some more about that during discussion if you'd like. So what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to start with a question that I often get, when people want to know more about the movements that I study. And so just backing up a little bit. So I've written about a relatively obscure movement called the Christian Reconstructionists, who developed a systematic, biblical in their understanding of the Bible, a systematic way of thinking about life and culture, where everything is, as they put it, to be brought under the lordship of Christ. And this is a kind of theocratic understanding of what Christians ought to do in the world and how we ought to reshape, how society ought to be reshaped in terms of theocratic values. That movement, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this happened, but that movement kind of made its way into the charismatic Pentecostal wings of American Christianity, and gave us this movement that we're calling the New Apostolic Reformation, which is in some ways the sort of religiously infused undercurrent to the movement that we call Christian nationalism. So that just kind of gives you a little framing to think about. It's hard to figure out where to pitch a talk like this because I don't know what the audience knows about these things or even about, Christianity or American Christianity. And anyway, so one of the things that I often get asked is so and so, and most recently it's been Mike Johnson, but is Mike Johnson or some other person a member of the NAR? So, journalists ask this, people who start to learn a little bit about the NAR ask questions framed in that way. And I want to suggest that it's the wrong question. And it's the wrong question in part because the NAR is incredibly diffused by design. There is no central figure who's in charge. There's no actual membership. There's no creedal formula that could mark out the boundaries such that someone could actually answer that question. And people in the Christian Reconstructionist movement and people in the NAR have done and said some things that are so controversial that people don't necessarily want to be associated with them anyway. So some people will just disown the label. But even more than that, I want to suggest that the question misunderstands how social movements actually work, and that most people don't have any idea about the origins of the frameworks and classification systems and kind of intellectual understandings with which they operate. With my students in my religious studies classes, the way I explain this is that most of you in the room are probably Christians, and a few of you have heard of Augustine, but probably none of you have heard of Averroes, right? So we don't know the people who laid the foundations for the ways that we see the world. We just accept certain things, and they seem true to us. And so I want to talk just a little bit about how social movements work. To try to unpack that a little bit. But I also think that this question is problematic because it doesn't focus on what really matters. And what matters is the influence that these movements have had out in the broader subculture, often among people who have no idea that that's where these ideas come from. And I want to talk also about the time horizon with which these movements work, because one of the reasons that folks who want to defend democracy have difficulty confronting the threat that this theocratic movement presents is that we are operating on really different time horizons. And I'm going to get to that. So quick background, dominionism, Christian Reconstructionism, the New Apostolic Reformation, and Christian nationalism. So bunch of words, right? I'm going to start about in the 1960s when this movement, Christian Reconstructionism, started to develop. There was a thinker, theologian, R.J. Rushdoony, who wrote shelves full of books. And there are some core positions that he laid out that made their way out into the larger culture. I'm going to talk about how that happened. But these are some important parts of Christian Reconstructionism to understand in order to see how it came forward and is an issue today. So first of all, is this thing called dominion theology? So this is rooted in the book of Genesis, where God told Adam and Eve to go out into the world and have dominion. Christian Reconstructionists use what they call the unity of Scripture, which is an idea from the Reformation that says that we need to take the entirety of the Bible as one continuing revelation, that contemporary Christians who think of the New Testament as replacing the Old Testament are actually heretics. And so the idea that God created Adam and Eve in the garden and gave them this dominion mandate is the way that they see the very purpose of human existence. And for them, that mandate and the ability to exercise dominion was restored with the resurrection. And so Christian Reconstructionists, they call the way that they want to restructure society, they call it theonomy, which means God's law. So it is a decidedly and admittedly theocratic movement. They talk about a biblical worldview, but what they mean by that, what they mean by that is based in that unity of Scripture. So it's a biblical worldview that is drawn from the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's not the Sermon on the Mount biblical worldview. It's more the Leviticus biblical worldview. And one of the reasons why they have been so successful, despite their very small numbers, is because they were the originators of what is now called the Christian education movement. In the 1960s, Rushdoony wrote a critique of public education, arguing that it was profoundly unbiblical and that Christians needed to get their kids out of public schools and put them in Christian schools. And he and his followers developed curriculum for this. They developed training sessions across the country to get more and more Christian schools established. They worked in the courts to get legal recognition for Christian education as a First Amendment religious freedom, and just basically built a Christian school movement that was infused with their understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And that movement drew people who had never heard of Rushdoony, didn't know anything about Christian Reconstructionism, but it was a private school movement, and it actually happened to also correspond with the desegregation movement. So there was this explosion of growth. And that framework became the framework for the Christian homeschool movement. So those two movements together were the institutional structures that made this theological system more than a theology. It's not merely a belief system. It's deeply rooted into a whole subculture of conservative American Protestantism. In the 1980s, one of the other leading Reconstructionists, Gary North, realized that with the charismatic and Pentecostal movements in Christianity exploding around the globe, that if the Reconstructionists could get the charismatics and Pentecostals to embrace dominion theology, then they would carry dominion theology all over the globe. And they did. And then you have the charismatics and Pentecostals developing their own form of dominionism that they called Seven Mountains dominionism. C. Peter Wagner, who developed it, attributes it to, in some ways, to Rushdoony. So there's a direct tie there. The framing of dominion in each system is a little bit different, but not very different. So together, these two movements created the basis for this Christian nationalist, theocratic, authoritarian vision for America. So we think that religions and really other social movements, social systems, we think of them as discrete and self-contained belief systems. So when people talk about, especially when people talk in interdisciplinary contexts like this one, among people who don't spend their time pondering what is religion, like we do in religious studies, people just think, oh, it's beliefs, right? But the problem is that's a very limited understanding of what religion is, because religions are really cultural systems, and they're much broader than belief systems. And people pick and choose the aspects of a religious culture that work for them at any given time. And for dominionists of both types, religion is much more than a set of theological points. So I could illustrate that by suggesting that, for example, if we were talking about the Christian Trinity, we would all recognize that as a theology. There's no kind of debating around the edges of that. But when we talk about the dismantling of public education, which is a primary goal of Christian Reconstructionists, when we talk about that, some people want to say, oh, that's not religious, it's political. But that's because they're defining what counts as religion differently. But for these people, all of life and culture is supposed to be brought under the lordship of Christ. Everything is religious. There is no realm of life that exists autonomous from the law of God. So the fluid assemblage of ideas, traditions, and practices, thinking about religion in that broader way, helps us understand them better. Here's an example of the fluidity of that over time. So another thing that reporters often ask me, or actually Twitter responders adamantly, are, oh, the NAR can't be dominionist. It's not possible. And the reason they think this is because it is true, these are rooted in divergent versions of Christianity. There's this kind of Reformed Calvinist wing that is the Reconstructionist, and there's the Pentecostal charismatic wing. Those two versions of Christianity have very different eschatologies. These are theologies about the end times, right? So the Reconstructionists have this idea that's called postmillennialism. They think that this is the kingdom of God. It was established at the resurrection, and it's the job of Christians through the exercise of dominion to build it. The charismatics are premillennial, and this is the version you know from popular culture. The world gets worse and worse until the rapture and the Great Tribulation, and that at some point in the middle of that, Jesus returns and establishes the kingdom of God. Those are different orientations to the world. They would lead to different ideas about how one might be required to live in the world. But what happened in the 1980s when Gary North got to work trying to convince the charismatics and the Pentecostals of the value of dominionism is they softened the edges of their premillennialism, and they decided that, theology is about the culmination of history. Well, they're theologies. They're the future. We don't know. But we have this version of how we ought to live in the world, what impact we ought to make in the world, how we ought to win the world for Jesus. And that dominion theology had a resonance that allowed them to grasp the dominion theology and just loosely hold the postmillennialism. They did this with proof texts, like, for example, Jesus told the disciples that they should occupy till he returns. You often would hear in the 1980s and 90s, you would hear charismatics and Pentecostals cite that verse. And importantly, they also embrace this time horizon of the postmillennialists. So millennium means 1,000 years, right? Postmillennialists think that it could be 1,000 years or more that it takes to rebuild the kingdom of God, right? In fact, one of the Reconstructionist homeschool ministries sells a practicum. I just happened to get my hands on a copy of it a couple of weeks ago for building a 200-year plan for a family dynasty. They're thinking in 200-year plans at a minimum, maybe 1,000 years. So when we're thinking in terms of the election cycle or the current crisis, we're not equipped to meet the confrontation that is between theocracy and democracy. So to understand and respond to the threat of theocratic authoritarianism, we need to realize that trying to label a person as New Apostolic Reformation or engaging in a discussion over whether or not so-and-so is a New Apostolic Reformationist or not, first of all, it sidelines us from stuff that's important. I mean, the best that could come out of that is everybody could agree yes, and you haven't really even gotten anywhere. But really, what happens with somebody like Mike Johnson? Mike Johnson embraced a whole bunch of things that were Christian Reconstructionist-like. But he doesn't identify as one. So I say yes, he says no, and then where are we, right? So we have to realize that whole conversation is not fruitful. And instead, we need to look for the influence and the ideas and the strategies and the goals. And we need to see how this is playing out in the world so that we can identify it. And I'm going to suggest that you can hear it in their language if you know how to listen for it. So these are some terms, and I'm going to need to move. Oh, good. I can move that a little bit. All right. So these are some terms that you're going to hear out in the world now that you've started thinking about this. And I'm going to suggest to you that this should tip you off to there's Christian Reconstructionist or there's New Apostolic Reformation stuff going on here when people talk like this. So the first are words that we've been using over the last few minutes: the dominionism, a biblical worldview. They also use patriarchy in a positive way. They talk about biblical patriarchy as a goal. Since they are about dismantling the public schools, they call public schools government schools instead of public schools. They talk about the civil government instead of the government. And we could talk about the second row here are things that I haven't talked about much already, but they are important categories, and we could talk about them if you'd like to. So they'll talk about the civil government instead of government. There's a whole movement of something called lesser magistrates that's become really important among county sheriffs and could be more important sort of post 2024 election, depending on how things go. They'll talk about biblical spheres of authority, and this is how they frame their biblical worldview. And they talk about covenant marriage. That's also something that we could discuss. Those are all when you hear that language, these people are drawing from this well of Christian Reconstructionism. Um, so the next row of terms are terms that are the variation brought by the New Apostolic Reformation. So their version of dominion is the Seven Mountains Mandate. And they talk about apostles and prophets in modern terms. And they talk about spiritual warfare in very literal ways, which, getting back to your framing for your center in the discussion about hate, spiritual warfare as literal is a really unsettling and dangerous kind of thing, because rather than thinking of Satan as this mythic figure, they think of Satan as controlling their next door neighbors. They'll talk about the spirit of Jezebel, for example, and it conflates disputes that are earthly disputes that they might have with somebody, with this kind of cosmic battle between God and Satan in ways that I think are really dangerous. So to sum up, dominionism and the New Apostolic Reformation, they come from a convergence of older forms and categories of Christianity. One of the things people sometimes say in response to all of this is, well, they're not real Christians. And I don't, you get into the same kind of quibbling about what counts as a real Christian. But for my purposes, these are easily connected to historic Orthodox forms of Christianity. So you have to debate something else if you want to talk about them not really being Christian. They have coalesced around Trump, but he is not the source. And I think this is a really important thing for us to ponder, because this has been on the rise, like I said, since the 60s, certainly over the last 20 years. And so it predates him, and it will still be something that we are trying to fight in order to keep a democratic society long after he's gone. The old frame, in order to understand this, we need to recognize that old frameworks don't apply if they ever did. So things like denomination and theological threads and what counts as religious, those things are all shaken up by the New Apostolic Reformation. And efforts to label somebody as a member, they're not only pointless, but it's the influence that matters, and they distract those debates they distract us from what's important, which is the theocratic authoritarianism. So I look forward to hearing from Peter, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Julie. Peter, you're up.
Thanks, Julie. That was awesome. And thanks to Ken Stern and the Bard Center for the study of hate. I'm really happy to be doing this with Julie, who I've learned so much from over the years. And I should say up front, there are some other researchers and journalists and scholars who've illuminated this movement, including Rachel Tabachnik, Bruce Wilson, Fred Clarkson, Sarah Posner, Adele Stan, Anthea Butler, Andre Gagne, Matthew Taylor, Brad Anishi, and others. There's a lot of fascinating work going on right now. And I hope that Right Wing Watch, which does a lot of daily reporting on this movement, can be a useful resource for all of you. So Julie, that was such a great setup for understanding the roots and worldview of this movement. And I'm going to move into sort of evidence of their political influence in our country, because the talk of spiritual warfare and prophets and apostles and all of that can really be strange can come across a strange language for people who aren't familiar with this movement, and who they think that it might be reason to think of this as a fringe movement, or as something that is not something that requires a lot of attention. But I am here to say that this is a movement with global ambitions and global influence, and in the United States, it is really very connected to the highest levels of political power in our country. So that's why I pay so much attention to these folks. So I'm going to start here. 2000. That was 1 year after the creation of the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, which is a new apostolic network leadership structure. Dutch Sheets, Bill Bright, and others called for prayer and fasting for the election, leading Christian nationalist David Barton to call it, at the time, the most prayed for presidential election in American history. And he called the Supreme Court assisted Bush victory an answer to the prayer. Now, at the heart of the storm in Florida was Secretary of State Katherine Harris, who has cited NAR elders Dutch Sheets and Sidney Jacobs as her spiritual mentors. And several years later, while she was a member of Congress, Harris spoke at Coral Ridge Ministries' Reclaiming America for Christ conference. So that's this is early in the days of the NAR. I'm going to skip ahead now to the 2008 election, which is when I first started paying real close attention to the coming together of what I thought of as traditional religious right leaders with these dominionist prophets and apostles. They were all united in opposition to the candidacy of Barack Obama, but they were not terribly excited about John McCain. That is, until he chose Sarah Palin as his running mate. Palin had ties to NAR figures, and she was quickly declared an Esther on a mission from God. This image of Sidney Jacobs is from a God TV special that was in heavy rotation in the days before the election, urging conservative Christians to vote and that the future of the country was on the line. The special featured lots of spiritual warfare rhetoric, and it included people like James Dobson and Tony Perkins, and then also a lot of NAR leaders, Rick Joyner, Lou Engle, Mike Bickle, Jim Garlow. Engle and Garlow were also active in 2008 promoting California's Prop 8, which added a ban on same-sex couples marrying to the state constitution. Garlow was instrumental in organizing among churches, and Engle held one of his patented stadium-sized prayer rallies, which he's done around the country, and he did that. He did his first one of those in 2000 on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and he did another one on the National Mall in 2008, and then did one in California in favor of Prop 8. Now, they were not successful, of course, in preventing Barack Obama's election, but they didn't go home. After Obama's victory, there was a flourishing of new religious right groups and coalitions. It seemed like in 2009, 2010, there was some new group or some new coalition formed, just one after another. One of them, the Freedom Federation, brought together religious right political groups with Sidney Jacobs Generals International, Lou Engle's The Call, Rick Joyner's Oak Initiative and Morning Star Ministry, and others, along with Americans for Prosperity, who made sure to get opposition to progressive taxation included in the group's statement of values. Newt Gingrich started a group in 2010, and he hired Jim Garlow to run it. So there's a lot of overlap between what we might think of as different parts of this movement. People like the Family Research Council Vice President Jerry Boykin were and are a bridge between the different parts of the religious right. He served on the board of Joyner's Oak Initiative. He still serves on the board of Joyner's Ministry, along with Lance Wallnau, one of the major promoters of Seven Mountains Dominionism, which has become a rhetorical framework used across the religious right. Julie talked about its roots in NAR, but it has really been adopted by other religious right groups who might not share the theology behind it, but they see it as a very useful rhetorical framework for encouraging conservative Christians of all theological stripes to get more politically engaged. Movement leaders opposed the Obama administration's healthcare reform efforts. There was an event sponsored by the Family Research Council at which Lou Engle spoke and then introduced Member of Congress Michelle Bachmann. At an Oak Initiative event, FRC's Boykin said that the Affordable Care Act would empower Barack Obama to create an army of brown shirts to subjugate the US population, the kind of fear-mongering that we see a lot. And movement leaders were really committed to preventing Obama's reelection. So in 2012, in preparation for trying to defeat Obama, some NAR figures urged Texas Governor Rick Perry to join the race. And he did so with a prayer rally called The Response that was modeled after Lou Engle's The Call events. It was held in a sports arena in 2011. It featured a whole array of NAR leaders. It was emceed by Mike Bickle. And it was a de facto endorsement of Perry by the movement leaders, although they all pretended it was just a prayer rally and wasn't at all political. But it was also a really extraordinary endorsement of the movement by a sitting governor, by a high-level political official And I thought that was reminiscent of Ronald Reagan telling the Christian right leaders that he endorsed them back in 1980 when the religious right first burst onto the political scene. So Perry's official announcement came just 7 days after the response, which was the name of the prayer rally, and other response rallies were organized in other states that year, hosted and attended by Republican governors. And Rick Perry attended the one that was in South Carolina just days before the Republican primary there. Unfortunately for NAR leaders, Perry's campaign was a flop, and they did not get the nominee they hoped for, and they did not keep Barack Obama from getting reelected. So I'm going to scoot ahead now to the Trump era, which was really the golden era and political influence for the dominionist movement in the United States. While many religious right figures had initially backed Ted Cruz in the Republican primary, apostles and prophets from the NAR were among the earliest members of Trump's Amen Corner, thanks to his longtime spiritual advisor, Paula White. They were among the religious right leaders who took the deal that Trump offered them. If they put him in the White House, he would give them the Supreme Court of their dreams, one that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Lance Wallnau declared Trump to be God's anointed, had his book title, God's Chaos Candidate. Charisma publisher Steve Strang used his platform's popularity among Pentecostal Christians to push the idea that Trump was indeed God's candidate. And even Hispanic evangelical leader Samuel Rodriguez, who was initially reluctant to back Trump because of his anti-immigrant rhetoric, came around and told his followers that Trump's pledge to create an anti-abortion Supreme Court was more important than his attacks on immigrants. When Trump won, a group of NAR leaders came together to form the POTUS Shield Network, POTUS referring not only to President of the United States, but Prophetic Order of the United States. And their mission was to wage spiritual warfare on Trump's behalf, which they did throughout his administration, denouncing Trump's opponents as demonic, praying for God to knock off Supreme Court justices to create vacancies for Trump to fill, calling on angel armies to purge Trump's deep state enemies from the FBI and Justice Department, and rallying support for his judicial nominees. With Paula White given an official position in the White House, she and her One Voice prayer movement served as a de facto liaison between the Trump campaign and its dominionist supporters. And she made sure that a parade of movement leaders were regularly moving through the Oval Office to tell Trump he was doing God's work. And when Trump signed an executive order on religious liberty in the Rose Garden, Paula White emceed, and Cindy Jacobs was in the crowd. When the administration wanted to build support for its Middle East peace plan, Lance Wallnau was among the insiders invited to the White House for a closed-door preview of that policy. So enjoying the kind of access they'd never had before, Trump's dominionist supporters pulled out all the stops to try to get him elected. There were a host of prophecies that God would ensure his victory. They held rallies on the Mall. They did everything you would try to do. And when they failed, they energetically pushed his lies about the election. They mobilized prayer calls, took part and mobilized rallies to support Trump's so-called Stop the Steal movement. And they really helped to foment the rage that fueled the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The day before, on January 5th, there was an hours-long rally near the White House that had fired up Trump supporters with conspiracy theories and aggressive Christian nationalism and threats of violence. And one of the speakers at that was a senior NAR leader, Che Ahn, who told the crowd that they were part of the most important week in American history and said, I believe that this week we're going to throw Jezebel out and Jehu's going to raise up, and we're going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And on the morning of the 6th, Paula White kicked off Trump's rally on the Ellipse with a prayer that God's people would rise up and stand strong, and that God would give them holy boldness. And she asked that every adversary be overturned right now in the name of Jesus. At the Capitol that day, the Appeal to Heaven flag, which Dutch Sheets had adopted and promoted as an NAR battle emblem, was pretty much everywhere. And of course, that flag has flown over the Alito's Beach House and outside the door of House Speaker Mike Johnson's office. So that brings us to NAR connections to MAGA Republican leaders today. So earlier this year, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson and a couple dozen members of Congress gathered with Cheon and other NAR leaders at the Museum of the Bible to pray and repent on behalf of the nation. Speaker Johnson is one of many Republican politicians who've taken part in the prayer calls that Jim Garlow began hosting in 2020 as part of that effort to keep Trump in power, and they've continued. And on one of those calls, Johnson has said that Garlow had a profound influence on his life. The event at the Museum of the Bible was co-hosted by Garlow and FRC President Tony Perkins. Just another reminder of those close ties. And Perkins really deployed NAR spiritual rhetoric, talking about demonic attacks and battles in the heavenlies, which I thought was pretty interesting. We also had members of Congress deploying that similar spiritual warfare rhetoric. Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, we tie the hands of Satan and all his demons. Representative Greg Steube, we bind the demonic forces of resistance and rebellion among God's people. So spiritual warfare rhetoric is abundant in the MAGA movement. I was in Milwaukee in July for the Republican National Convention at a Heritage Foundation event promoting the Project 2025 policy agenda. Tucker Carlson was the keynote speaker, and he told attendees that they're engaged in a spiritual battle against anti-human forces that want to eliminate Christians. And this idea that the American political scene is not about left or right, or not even Republicans versus Democrats, but a spiritual battle between good and evil, between God's allies and agents of Satan, has become commonplace. I heard it from Tucker Carlson, from a Moms for Liberty co-founder, from RNC co-chair Laura Trump, and others. Paula White was the first speaker at an RNC prayer breakfast that featured J.D. Vance, Mike Johnson, and RNC Chair Michael Whatley. And the middle image on the slide is Donald Trump Jr. speaking with Gene Bailey, host of the show Flashpoint, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I just want to quickly highlight some ongoing events that are evidence of NAR leaders' proximity to power and their engagement in this year's elections. Lance Wallnau and Mario Murillo have teamed up with Turning Point USA for what they call the Courage Tour, which is aimed at electing Trump by breaking demonic strongholds in swing states. It combines political organizing with revival and worship and miracle doing, according to them. Wallnau calls Vice President Kamala Harris the devil's choice, and Murillo says that her candidacy is a sign that demonic power is at work. And Wallnau has described the purpose of the tour as preparing Christians to rule and reign when Christ returns by training them to occupy territory now. There's that occupy rhetoric Julie talked about. And when the tour stopped in Wisconsin in July, political activist Joshua Standifer urged attendees to sign up to serve as election workers so that they can function as a Trojan horse for the Christian nationalist political movement. His organization, the Lion of Judah, says it's time that Christians, led by the Holy Spirit, take back the mountain of government and transform our nation. The Reawaken America tour has reached and potentially radicalized thousands of Americans by bringing together Trump family members, Christian nationalist figures, MAGA movement insiders like Michael Flynn, and various conspiracy theorists. And Trump himself has called into at least one of those. Flashpoint, the program that we saw Donald Trump Jr. speaking with, is a program on Kenneth Copeland's Victory Channel. It started in the fall of 2020 and has been a major source of misinformation about the 2020 election and the insurrection and pro-Trump propaganda. And Trump rewarded Flashpoint's loyalty with a sit-down interview with host Gene Bailey at Mar-a-Lago last year. Flashpoint also goes on the road with live events, which feature speakers like Wallnau and Dutch Sheets. And the first Flashpoint live event this year was at Andrew Wommack's Bible College in Woodland Park, Colorado. Womack supporters took over the local school board, but his effort to take over the city council failed when voters rejected his candidates this year. And you may have seen a viral video from a Flashpoint Live event at which Dutch Sheets led the audience in making a Watchman decree declaring that the church was God's governing body on earth. Flashpoint was in Milwaukee for the RNC and Chicago for the DNC, where guests included Walnow and Charlie Kirk. The Kingdom to the Capitol tour is a 50-state roadshow that put on by musician and right-wing activist Sean Feucht. And he often gets public officials to participate. And in Alabama, he was greeted by Chief Justice Tom Parker, notorious for his Christian nationalist opinion in an IVF case. Feucht has also held rallies on the National Mall and worship services in the Capitol Rotunda, attended by members of Congress. And there's so many prayer calls. There's so many groups that are sponsoring ongoing prayer calls, inviting right-wing politicians, engaging in spiritual warfare against their enemies. In addition to Garlow's, there's Intercessors for America, whose host Dave Kubal is close to Paula White. And last year, Apostle Clay Nash hosted a 50-state series of calls that featured Republican Party officials, state legislators, and state Supreme Court candidates. So just a few things that are coming up that you have a chance to enjoy if you would like. A so-called 50-state fight kicks off September 15th by Jim Garlow. That's a coalition effort. The image here is from the 2020 version, which called on God to create a second miracle by re-electing Trump and denounced his opponents as satanic. Family Research Council's annual activist conference is coming up October 3rd to 6th in DC. Lou Engle has called 1 million women and their families to the National Mall in DC for a last stand for America on October 12th. And Sean Feucht is bringing an end to his Kingdom of the Capitol to the Capitol tour with a rally on the National Mall on October 26th. And that picture of Feucht with Senator Josh Hawley is from one of Feucht's earlier rallies in the National Mall. And then I'm just going to mention a little bit of breaking news, which I just found out today, courtesy of my email, which is that Donald Trump is joining a prayer for the debate call tonight, organized by Paula White's National Faith Advisory Board, which is the organization that she set up after Trump left off power to basically continue doing what she was doing from the White House. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter, so much for that. And thank you, Julie. I encourage people to continue putting in questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can by the top of the hour. Before I go to this, I have a couple of things I just wanted to ask either of you. Could somebody explain a little bit more what the seven mountains mean? When people use that term or when they hear it, what do they understand it to mean? And why is it important?
I could take that. Seven mountains are what sometimes called the seven spheres of influence. They're what they see as the centers of influence in culture: government, media, arts and entertainment, church, family, religion, education. And that basically the NAR worldview is that the problems in society are because those mountains have been dominated by people who are demonic or influenced by demons, and that to transform society, you need to have those mountains being dominated by the right kind of Christians who see the world as they do.
Great, thank you. And I guess one other sort of just framing question. I mean, you talked obviously the connections with Trump and some elected officials, and Julia educated us that it's really not, possible to think about this in terms of people with membership cards or something like that. But how many people, if you ask them, would sort of see the world in this way? What percentage of the American population do you think?
Well, it's hard to quantify. And I think part of the reason it's hard to quantify is because there's no actual agreement on what this way might be, because the ideas are splintered and fractured. And I saw a couple of other questions in the chat that had to do with race and sovereign citizens, and the answer is yes, there's overlap. Like sovereign citizens will grab out notions like the lesser magistrate. Okay, so the lesser magistrate's idea it comes from Calvin, so it's kind of, it's got historical roots in traditional Christianity, but it's the idea that they're trying to sort when must Christians obey the law and when should Christians violate the law. And Calvin wrote about how lesser magistrates, that is lower level authorities, have responsibility to resist tyranny. So there's a whole sheriff's movement that's built that is very tied in with the sovereign citizens movement, that's built around this idea that sheriffs ought to stand up to and resist like federal level kinds of laws and requirements that these folks think are unbiblical. So they're justifying breaking the law at the local level and just ignoring sort of federal law because they don't believe that that's legitimate. And so they embrace that part of it, but they aren't necessarily post-millennialist, right? So if you wanted to pull a group together that you could actually count, there are no lines that would allow you to do the counting. This is why the kind of research that is, in the sociology of religion, you have this divide between the quantifiers and the ethnographers. I'm more of an ethnographer that goes out and does field work and tries to explain the subtle interconnections between things and the meaning making systems instead of the quantifications, because I don't think you can count it.
Thank you.
Uh,
Go ahead, Peter.
I just could touch on one more thing that I think all that's very true. Brad Christensen and Richard Flory wrote a book on what they called independent network charismatic Christianity, and described that as the fastest growing form of Christianity, both globally and in the US. So it's not a small phenomenon. And, various pollsters and sociologists have been doing more and more polling on Christian nationalist worldview and delving into that. And the Public Religion Research Institute has new polling that I think they're actually officially releasing tomorrow that includes some questions about Seven Mountains dominionism.
Great, thank you. And I also, like Julie, saw the questions, I think three or four of them about looking at questions of race and Christian identity. And I wondered if you both have some more thoughts about, I mean, if you look back at the history of the militia movement and the Oklahoma City bombing and the things that led up to that, I mean, there was a Christian identity idea that blacks weren't even human, Jews were literally satanic, offspring of Satan, and then you had this posse comitatus thought about the power of the sheriff, which was really behind a lot of what we saw in the Freemen's movement and a lot of that back in the 90s. Is that sort of prehistory relevant to this movement? Do they see them as akin ideas, or do they see it as something, that comes from a different set of theological or political beliefs? What's the connection between what
I
we
think
saw?
the groups themselves would say that they're discrete and distinct from each other, but I think sociologists and historians looking at them have to see the overlap. Um, and I think we pointed to some very, very good examples in the Christian identity movement, for example. One of the things that they all share, so they have this way of framing these. So the Reconstructionists did a different kind of framing of spheres of authority, which is the civil government, the church, and the family. And each of those spheres has theocratic authority from God. And anytime that they do anything that is outside their legitimate sphere, they are being tyrannical. This is all their language, obviously, not mine. And so this has a really rich theological background for anti-government sentiment. So you all out west, where you have those various anti-government movements, many of them adopt Christian Reconstructionist ideas. So the whole effort to kind of take over Idaho and make Idaho into a Christian civilization is spearheaded by this guy named Doug Wilson, who's not part of the New Apostolic Reformation charismatic wing, but he's very much related to the Christian Reconstructionists, although he says he's not. And there's this deep anti-government sentiment there that plays into those other kinds of movements that you listed.
Great, thank you. And I have one other question before I get into some of the other ones that are posted. So, in this worldview, what happens to Muslims, to Sikhs, to Hindus, to Jews, to atheists? How do we all fit in?
Should I take that one, Peter? Okay. So the other framework here, like, this, it's hard to unravel all of these things, right? So this other thing is called presuppositionalism, which is the view that there's really only two sources of truth. There's God's revelation, and then there's everything else that humans come up with in their brains. They call that humanism. And they say that that's basically the sin in the Garden of Eden, which is this claim for the autonomy of human reason apart from the Bible. So everything that is not their sort of biblical Christianity goes into this other basket that is humanism. So Muslims and Hindus and Jews and I don't know, whatever you are, if you're not, if you're Episcopalian, whatever you are that isn't them goes into this other category. And Gary North, for example, wrote that pluralism is really polytheism. I don't remember, I'm not aware of any of their writings that actually, so they advocate the death penalty for a whole slew of things from Old Testament biblical law. And of course, idolatry would have been one of those things. I don't remember an example of them actually writing that, but it would be a logical conclusion. Pluralism is not a value in this system. You could say that with certainty for the very least. What they would do about people who don't embrace biblical Christianity, I think that remains to be seen. Hopefully not, maybe.
Yeah, there's an interesting way to hear too, in which the theology that the difference between the rapture and the non-rapture theology that Julie mentioned is that if you don't believe in the rapture, you don't think God is coming back to save a defeated church. You think God is coming back to rule and reign with the triumphant church. So the real promise, the real enticement that is offered to people by this worldview is that they can take part in an immense epic thing, which is speeding the return of Jesus Christ and speeding the return of his kingdom, in which everyone will be forced to kneel, to bow the knee to his kingdom. And so that kind of plays into this broader shift in the right-wing political movement away from the libertarian mistrust of government that was so much part of it for so long, and into more of a MAGA movement embracing, yeah, we're going to take power and we're going to use that power to enforce our biblical worldview or our political worldview.
Great, thank you. I have a question from a colleague at the Bard in Berlin. Um, Asking, is NAR genuinely rooted in religious beliefs, or does it have an ulterior motive of acquiring absolute power under the guise of Christianity using religion as a mass conscription tool? Can NAR be seen as a form of nationalism aimed at strengthening the identity of white middle-class Americans who feel threatened by globalization and liberalism? Additionally, should the permeation of the mainstream American politics by the extreme religious beliefs be considered in the same global context as other populist movements that use religion to gather supporters, or should it be viewed separately? There's a whole bunch there, but I think it raises also one other question. I mean, do these folks see this as just entirely an American thing, or do they see, the same sort of prescription that they want for society in England and Germany and elsewhere as some others who see the world in terms of whiteness do?
It's definitely global, absolutely global. If you go right back to the thing I said about Gary North, the reason that he wanted to get the charismatics to embrace dominion theology is because it would take it around the world. So there's that. I don't find the distinctions that your colleague from Berlin was trying to draw between religion and other things. I'd need a whole day of conversation to figure out how he's defining all those terms, because I think religion is those things. So is it this or that? And I would just say yes. It's all those things. But I don't think, I'm not convinced that it's a duplicitous, we want this, but we're going to say this instead. I think that it is how they understand religion. All of life is religious. There is no sphere of life outside of religion. So yes, they are making a religious claim when they make their Christian nationalist claims.
Thank you, Peter. You have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say that because it is global, as Julie mentioned, it is also true that the Pentecostal movement in the US tends to be more multiracial than, say, fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. And so scholars have written about how the history of white supremacy is very strongly linked in with the Christian nationalism movement, and that's a little more complicated with NAR and the Pentecostal movement because they have been more explicitly multiracial in their ambition and goals. But in the United States, in our current political context, their political goals are not really distinguishable from the other Christian nationalists. And they are about building power to use the government to impose their worldview or to have the government enforce their worldview.
Great, thank you.
And to just, can I add to that a little bit? Because Peter's exactly right. And it isn't just about race. If you noticed in all of Peter's images, there were women, right? And when I was talking about biblical patriarchy, right? These folks don't agree on the place of women. But that goes to the larger point is that we want those of us, especially those of us who spend our lives around ideas, right? We want a kind of coherent, systematic, consistent way of thinking about, we want frameworks and rubrics and we want all that, but that it's not that, it's messy. And people take this part and that part and they put it together with this part over here that someone from outside would look and say, these things are really inconsistent. But they are. Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to combine two questions. One is how involved is the Christian right in these movements? And the second is, can you discuss the interplay between NAR Seven Mountains and Catholic integral theology and how this moved from the realized eschatology?
Wow. I think we need Anthea here, don't we? Yeah, the list of names that Peter gave at the beginning, I second that list of wonderful scholars, and some of the others are much more versed in I think all you have to do is look at the Supreme Court and its compatibility. It's the overwhelming number of Catholics that is completely compatible with the MAGA movement at this point in history to recognize that it's an important factor, but it's not something that I feel like I have expertise in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we saw that the Catholic right and the evangelical right learned to look past their theological differences in order to find common political cause in opposing feminism and reproductive rights and the LGBT movement. And I think that continues now with both the fundamentalist evangelicals overlooking their theological differences with charismatic Pentecostals in order to work together toward political dominion. And the Catholic integralists deserve a whole separate webinar, but you can see that they are also part of this distrust of democracy and where it has led us, and leaning toward the authoritarian Christian ruler who is not afraid of using the power of government to enforce people to live according to a certain, biblical worldview or kind of virtue. And, I wanted to say too, we also see this reflected in Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation and its right-wing Catholic president, Kevin Roberts, who says in his introduction to Project 25's policy agenda, I'm paraphrasing, that freedom is not the freedom to live how you want, it's the freedom to live how you ought. And so for all their talk about freedom, what they mean is freedom to live the way they think the Bible tells you to live.
Thank you for that. And I'll sneak in one final question. I know we're going to be over, but somebody asked, how do people who are religious tolerate the hypocrisy of supporting Trump? And Julie and Peter both talked about this some, especially with the politics of overturning Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is overturned. There's, two-thirds of the Supreme Court see the world in the way that I suspect these voters would approve. So what's the motivation to continue to support him? To get all nine justices? Trump is not a figure that you would otherwise think that they would be attracted to. But what's the attraction going forward?
The attraction is the complete control of culture and society, really, as Peter articulately put just a second ago. I'm not sure I see it as hypocrisy. Because it seems to me that if to claim it's hypocrisy, I would have to feel like I understand them thoroughly, and somehow they're saying they're. I don't. Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me if we think it's hypocritical, we probably aren't really understanding how it all fits together for them. That doesn't mean it's right or good or anything of the sort. Um, but I'm the last person in the world to end up on the happy note. But something that occurred to me in the last thing that Peter said was it is the case that and we've been talking about this the whole hour. There is this odd amalgam of groups that really don't like each other. And a century ago they would have seen each other as mortal enemies. And now for the moment, they have made common cause in ways that have the rest of us pretty disturbed. And I don't know no one knows where it's going to go from here, but it is a bright spot that they don't like each other. And if they get to a point where they're not focused on fighting the rest of us, they will turn on each other. Um,
Okay.
And I'll say that it's true that the religious right abandoned the way they used to talk about the importance of moral leaders, the way they talked when Bill
sure.
Clinton was president, for example. They have abandoned that completely because they now take the line that the Bible is full of examples of God using flawed people. And Trump has been compared to every biblical figure you can imagine. King David, Saul, people who
Cyrus.
were not models of moral living, but God used them. And this whole idea that Christianity is so threatened in the United States and Christians are so persecuted by the woke left and the demonic blah 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 that God needed someone to be who was a fighter. And so they said Trump had a breaker anointing. I mean, his purpose was to come in and break stuff up, to break up democratic norms, to break up the rules that we've been living by. So that's part of the deal for them is they want someone who is willing to not be a good boy and not follow the rules. And of course, Trump is happy to give them that. Um, so I think that's how they justify it. And they were happy with the results, with Roe v. Wade, and their view of the Democratic Party as demonic, as progressive movement, as demonic and evil is enough for them to continue the support for this guy who says he's going to fight all that.
Thank you both for educating so many of us on this important issue. I really appreciate it. And I'll send out an email tomorrow with contact information if people want to, follow up the conversations with you and support the work that you're doing. But we really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.